Felicia, would you say a prayer?
O God of grace, as we enter this most holy of weeks, we pray your blessing upon each of us, that we may somehow walk in the way that you call us, the way of the cross. Thank you for Amy and her willingness to share her research and her experiences with these stations. May they bless us. May they cause us pause. And may they draw us closer to you and your Son, in whose name we pray. Amen.
First slide, please. Today I'm inviting you to approach the Stations of the Cross in what might be for some of you a new way. For some of you, the Stations of the Cross are entirely new. Let's get an idea of that. So who is not really familiar with Stations of the Cross at all? Super. Who kind of knows, has done them a couple times, and who, other end of the spectrum, this is part of your yearly or even more than yearly experience of walking the stations. Okay, so we have a whole gamut. I'm going to spend a little bit of time on the history. You can ask me questions, please feel free. I'll spend a tiny bit of time on the multiplicity of ways that people use this ritual. And then then I'll invite you to the way that I have been invited to use the Stations of the Cross, and that is as a pilgrimage of surrender. And I'm calling it for us. It was given to me a different title, and I'll get that to you in just a moment with my story. First half will be a lot of my talking. Please feel free to interrupt, give your experience, ask questions. Second half will be approaching 3 different stations through this model of surrender. And we will use 3 different contemplative practices, one for each of them. You don't have to have any experience with any of that. I'll walk us through it. So first half will be a little bit more headspace maybe. Second half, we're going to go into practice. We already are used to it from Raven's class last week. I'm a little bit jealous. I told him he got to have chocolate and I have to talk about death. I'm a Scorpio rising, so that's sort of that's the word. All right. Next. Yep, that's it. So my invitation to meet with Stations of the Cross took rather a long time for me to get. Let's see, where do I want to start? I spent a lot of time at the Stations of the Cross in Jerusalem, the actual stations. In my 20s, I lived in Jordan. I would go back and forth to Israel all the time, and I spent a lot of time there. It wasn't my tradition. I was raised Southern Baptist and then Presbyterian. I didn't really know much about Catholicism, except it seemed kind of cool, lots of rituals. I liked it. But what really spoke to me in Jerusalem, walking these stations, was how integrated they are with the land itself, and some of you have been and walked there. So this wasn't really my tradition at all. Put that aside for a minute. I had no connection, no attachment to it. And some of you know a little bit of my story. If so, sorry to repeat. This story that I'm about to tell has lots of different pilgrimages within it. Some I'm still on. So in the year 2000, this time of year, I started to get really, really sick. My son was a year old. I had left my my old job. I was an archaeologist, an art historian, and I was a professor. During the year, I would be a professor. Summers, I would go dig in mostly Greece, sometimes the Middle East. I had taken a sabbatical to spend with my son, my first child. And during that time, I got really, really sick. And my diagnosis was complicated. My doctors, I lived in Oklahoma at the time, they sent me to Minnesota, to the Mayo Clinic. And by the time I got there, they found that I had already had a collapsed lung for 3 weeks, so I was admitted to the hospital immediately while they continued to try to figure out what to do with me. My initial diagnosis was one that only 12 people had received at that point, and they had all received it by autopsy. So that's not the best news ever, right? So I was in the hospital, getting all of this news, little baby. All the nights were really, really tough. And those of you who have spent nights in a hospital know they can be very lonely. And I spent a lot of time praying, and what I realized was my body was breaking down. I had a multi-organ failure, and my body was doing a great job of dying, but I realized I had no idea how to do this. I had no way to go about surrender. And it wasn't because I hadn't been taught about surrender. I was raised Christian. I knew all about Jesus's words about surrender, unless a wheat falls to the ground, and all of that thing, give up your life to save it. I knew all of that. And I also had taught world religion. So I knew that it wasn't Jesus alone who talked about this. Every single wisdom tradition says we got to learn to surrender. We have to learn to die before we die. So in my head, I had a lot of ideas about it, but I had never practiced surrender. I grew up in this culture in Europe and in the States where surrender isn't really a good word. Joe and I were just talking about this, right? I mean, what's our response to that word surrender?
No way.
No way. Never surrender. It's giving up. It's giving up, right? And I was taught that if you lose a job, you go get a new one. Or if you end a relationship, you get back out there and find somebody else. That was just the way. But I was holding my little son, and I knew I needed to figure this out. So I had a surgery that slowed down that progression immensely. But I was still sick, and I was going to always be sick. And I was going to always be living and dying, as we all are. I'm just much more aware of it than I was before. So as my son was learning to walk, I was not able to walk, all of that stuff. So I realized after I had recovered from that surgery, I need to figure this out. I need to learn how to do this surrender thing. So I have been an academic. I cast this huge net. I got lots of teachers and practices, read everything, gathered tools. And the one tradition that never really spoke to me was my own tradition, the Christian tradition. So I became a Buddhist practitioner. Many of you know that I'm a Buddhist practitioner. I started working in a shamanic tradition with my ancestors. Christianity was always kind of over here. Wasn't super comfortable with it. Fast forward 13 years, Raven's now in my life. I continue to go back to Mayo for checkups. And that was a pilgrimage every single time, because not only had my life been saved there, but the way that my life had been saved there was through somebody else's life. I had a part of somebody else's, so his life ended there. Very, very emotional place for us. So this was Raven's first time. It was just going for, checkups. But some of you have been to Mayo. It's a huge complex with 2 large hospitals and lots of other buildings. And there are many, many chapels, meditation centers, and I do all of them. It's kind of a big thing, right? So we were sitting in a very ornate chapel in my hospital, St. Mary's. That's where they do cardiac surgeries, amongst other things. We're meditating, and all of a sudden I hear or feel or know, you all know what I mean, this sentence that says, the Stations of the Cross can be used for conscious death and dying. At the time, I happened to be writing a dissertation on conscious death and dying. And so I opened my eyes and looked for the intended recipient of that message, because it obviously wasn't me. And I said, gosh, God, that's a great idea. Because the divine needs my champion, obviously. I just put that away. Like, okay, that's interesting, but I don't really know it. This isn't really my tradition, and definitely not high Catholic kind of stuff. But that message kept, this is in 2013, that message kept becoming stronger and stronger for me. And this is the way of pilgrimage. Sometimes we get the invitation, and if we don't take it, we'll get other invitations and other invitations. So about a year later, Raven and I were walking a labyrinth. We tend to do that, and we get to play with labyrinths here together, both in a workshop in 2 weeks, and then we're going to go together on a field trip. Labyrinths are a really important way to do a pilgrimage. We just go on the International Labyrinth Finder. Sometimes when we're on a day out and say, where's a labyrinth by where we're going, let's just go walk one. We had done that. We were in Boulder. St. Aidan's Church has connecting labyrinths, 2 labyrinths together next to each other with a little pathway between them. So we thought that's fun. We haven't done that. So I must stress that this is summertime, is well past Holy Week. There's no remnants of Holy Week around. The lawn is immaculate. There's not a piece of trash anywhere. We don't see anything, right? So Raven walks this labyrinth, I walk this labyrinth, and we cross paths to go to the opposite one. And he hands me a piece of paper. He says, I think this is for you. And of course, it's a little note about walking the stations of the cross. So that was a big piece of surrender already to say, okay, I'm gonna use this as the framework of my dissertation. I'm not really comfortable with this, but let me do it. So I spent a year learning about the stations and then continuing my work on conscious death and dying, which was the meat of the dissertation. And then in 2015, the next Good Friday, I went into heart failure again. And so I had been practicing what I'm going to teach you a little bit of today for a year, and then I really got to use it. So I was in Anschutz for about a month, and then flown, some of you know the story, flown back to Mayo for another surgery. And I really got to use this. This is I really got to use I really got to use this practice. So a little bit about stations before we go into heart space. Next slide. So the stations, how many of you have been to the stations in Jerusalem? So this is one of the signs of the Via Dolorosa. That's the Way of Tears or the Way of Sorrows. And here, of course, we have Hebrew and Arabic and English. And as I mentioned, the stations there are integrated because these are the sites where things happened, and there happens to be a shop right across from this site. I think it's profound. So the Stations of the Cross began to be practiced, we think, immediately after Jesus' death. People talk about following in the footsteps, both of him, his way, from when he was first given his what is it called? Sentence. That's it. His sentence to his death. Equally as important, it seems, is people followed Mary's pathway. It's said that she for days afterward would walk from where the crucifixion happened back to the beginning too. And people would walk both ways, these stations. And I think it's really easy to understand why people were doing that. I think oftentimes, Amy and I were talking about this, but on the roadside, you know, when you see a memorial to somebody who's died, and sometimes people go back again and again to these places. We have 2 right on the block in our neighborhood. These are sacred sites. Somebody's life ended there. And we often will go back to these places to try to make sense of what happened, to try to connect with them, their last moments. Working in the hospital is so hard for me because we lose so many people, and we just send their beloveds on their way. And I wish we would have a place there, but hospital leadership doesn't like it when I ask for a place to memorialize death at the hospital. You can understand why. Exactly. So right away, people started doing the stations, and they weren't set up in any, they did their own kind of stations. And what of course happened is over time, there were certain ones that became really popular. For hundreds of years, there were different stations going on. In the Middle Ages, people started to really walk the stations in Jerusalem, but also to create stations back at home. Obviously, they're talking Christianity. So they would either go to Jerusalem and bring back their experience of the stations and set up stations in their church, in their home. Or sometimes people never got to Jerusalem, they just did it at their home. Couple of things I want to say about that. That word station comes from Latin statio, and it mostly, almost exclusively, other than this context, is used for a post of like a soldier. This is my post to look at this territory. And that really helps me a little bit because it makes me think that for each of these stations, they're actually their own territory. In our instance, a territory of surrender or a territory of loss. This is the landscape of loss we're in with station 3 or station 3 to 11. The other thing is that falls are really important. So there are 3 falls in our 14 point stations of the cross. We'll talk about that in a minute. There's 3 for us. There were in the Middle Ages, there were people who followed stations with many more falls. And there were some stations that were only falls. I'm just gonna plant that seed for you to think about. I think that's really an amazing thing. When we're talking about surrender and humility, to only be focused on falling again and again and again. So in the 14th century, the Franciscan order in Jerusalem was given custodialship of all of the Christian sites in Jerusalem, and at that time they codified 14 stations. Those are the ones that you have on your handout. Those are the ones that Lori made. Those are the ones that we feel connected to because they've been used again and again and again. They are not all scriptural in that they didn't all end up in that one small library. They are all sacred, come from sacred texts. There have been movements to change them. Pope John Paul II decided he wanted ones that are only in the canonical scriptures, and so he changed them. That hasn't stuck with some people. All right, next. All right, and so here, that list is exactly the list that you have right here, and we're not going to go through all of them. Just to point out that we start with Jesus being condemned, and we end with him being laid in the tomb, so we don't end with his death. There are also some places that will have a 15th station. That's his resurrection. That is not the way I do the Stations of the Cross. Do you want to say anything about that, Lori?
Well, I think that the whole purpose of that walk into dying is to die. And it's so easy for us to go, oh, no, let me just skip this one and go on to the resurrection. You know, we have whole traditions that have done that actually, that are just, okay, you know, nice to have this week, but we'll just skip ahead to it.
It doesn't make sense because I think you need to spend time with the way into death and then spend time with the death.
Especially, I've found, spend time with the death. You know, like, for years, I sort of battled with St. Paul's people to have a Holy Saturday space, to just have it be empty. You know, we empty it on Thursday night, and then Friday is kind of an emptiness. And I thought, we really need Holy Saturday to just have empty, you know, an empty tomb. But it's very hard with the church's needs for doing things like setting up for Easter, you know, and especially in a church where we're sharing with 2 other churches. So I've since moved it to the chapel, but it's really, really precious time. And if you spend time, like I usually spend about 3 hours meditating that day. And if you spend that time, you really learn a lot. And you know, yeah. The other thing I wanted to say, is this a good time to talk about my experience with making stations, or do you want to wait?
No, this is great time.
Okay. So, you know, you talk about the 3 times that Jesus fell. When I wrote the icons of those 3 falls, that was extremely powerful for me. Because the thing that came to me is that progression, not only in his loss of being able to carry on in this task that was given to him by the oppressors was also the oppressor's reaction. And so, thinking about our, the struggle to try and do something that's against our very nature. So in one of the images, I have a soldier beating him on the back. And that's the message, is that he couldn't do what Rome, the empire, was asking him to do. And yet he's there in that dilemma with nobody to support him, nothing but him in that fallen place with the soldier, And that felt important to me also in the Jesus meets his mother, that it wasn't just Jesus and his mother in that image. It's, for me, it's again the interference of the soldiers. And so in that image, when I wrote that image, it's like he's trying to communicate. They're trying to communicate with each other, and they're doing it through a gaze instead of through words. But they have to get past this barrier of the soldier that's representative of the empire that they're, So it's all of that.
Thank you, Lori. I think next slide.
Okay.
Thank you so much. Yep, I've already covered all that. We can go to the next one. So what Lori's bringing up is really important. This I think a lot about ritual, and for me, one of the hallmarks of a ritual that lasts, this is 2,000 years with ritual, right, is that it can be so personal, and indeed is so personal, but is also so collective. We can do it corporately, but we can also have this incredibly private personal experience with it. And that it's solid enough in structure. We have our 14 stations to hold us through lots of different things, but it's also flexible enough that we can have our own relationship with it. I think that's important.
Yeah, and one of the things that I learned is, and it's just a kind of a myth really, but that in Ephesus, which is where Mary wound up by legend, that there is a Stations of the Cross, and that the story is that she continued to walk the stations all the rest of her life after Jesus was crucified. And that was very important, that she was really one of the people instrumental in making this tradition important to Christians.
The stations can and have been used in a variety of different ways. So as education, to teach both little ones, but also adults, this is what happened, this is our narrative, this is our story, our history. As a devotional practice. Some people approach it with atonement. Look at what we are still doing to Jesus. That's one way to approach it. Social justice, some of the most impactful ways of using the station, sometimes corporately, people will go through a town, and this might be something we can doing, and locate 14 stations that are really important today. How are people suffering? In a way that aligns with, let's say, station 8 is Jesus meeting the women of Jerusalem. We'll talk about that in just a bit. Is there a location in Fort Collins where we can really feel that same kind of energetic? So that's a powerful way to walk. As memorials for beloveds, people will set up stations. A lot of people who are suffering with chronic illness use the stations for their own support, and a plethora of other ways. That's what I mean by a really solid ritual, that it doesn't take away from the ritual that everyone, just like communion, yes, lots of ideas about communion, but we each have to do it all together, but we each have our own personal experience with it. So stations are exactly like that.
And they change, I mean.
Over time.
Over time.
Yeah, exactly. So some of you might know there's a Stations of the Cross in San Luis, Colorado, which is the oldest town. Have you been there, Cynthia?
Yes, there was a school project there, and I actually just pulled it up on my phone.
Yay!
Oh, yeah.
One of the stations is in the little booklet, so it's, the town commissioned a sculptor to create stations along a hillside, so it's actually depending on your level of mobility, it's not the easiest walk, and when I was in heart failure, we did it. And then there were some times that oh man. That Raven would drive me to the top of the hill and I would walk them backwards because I couldn't walk them forwards, yeah. They're about 3/4 life size, the stations, yeah, the statues. Bronze, yeah, really magnificent. And there's always to make the stations, to use them. I could obviously talk about that forever. Let's get to the next slide. So when I said that I wasn't taught about surrender, again, I was raised in a Christian household, I was very active. I had never heard this word on the screen, kenosis. How many of you have heard of it before? It is a really important word to following the way of Jesus, but we don't use it a lot at all. It's an English word. And the way we get that word is from this text, which was our gospel reading today. This is actually a hymn. It's from Paul. Paul didn't write this hymn. He recorded it. People were singing this, we think, in the early days following Jesus's life. So this is when Paul is talking about putting on the mind of Christ. So this is my translation, just a few words off from ours. Have this mind and heart, that's mine, among yourselves, which is yours in Christ Jesus, who though he was in the form of God, did not count equality with God a thing to be grasped, but allowed himself to be emptied, taking the form of a slave, being born in the likeness of humans. And being found in human form, he humbled himself and became obedient unto death, even death on a cross. So the italics there, allowed himself to be emptied. My translation of this Greek word above, echinosen, you see that in Greek. That's almost always translated as emptied himself. The E in the beginning, the epsilon in the beginning of that word actually makes it self-reflexive, and that makes it say, allowed himself to be emptied. Just for a minute, I want you to contemplate. To me, there's a vast difference between emptying myself and allowing myself to be emptied. Barb, you're nodding. Are you comfortable speaking to that? Or?
Oh, I just feel that, yeah, it's 180 degrees different.
Yeah,
For me.
Me too. I think it's like, I can purge my own closet, right? But if I say, Raven, you go in and purge my stuff. That's a difference, right? Or when we have to grab the two things from our house because our house is on fire, and we are allowing that. Of course, we're not allowing the fire, but we're allowing ourselves to say, I surrender. I don't know what's going to happen to this. That's total, absolute openness to anything that happens. And that, to me, is imperative. I can't follow Jesus's way unless it's that way. We've talked about this before. If he is sitting there with God, I know this is all going to work out. I'm going to be resurrected. It's going to be great. I'm not going to really feel this pain because I can rise above it. The story falls apart for me. Okay. So this is at the heart of the surrender on the way of the path. Next slide. I have 3 really important caveats. The first is only you can decide that you're surrendering. This word, kenosis, and this idea of surrender has been so misused in the abuse of people, in spiritual abuse. And there's actually a wonderful dissertation using Julian to counteract that. We love it. But people have said, I'm the priest, you must surrender to me. You must become like Christ and surrender to me. No, we are the only ones who can decide that we are on a pilgrimage at all and on a pilgrimage of surrender. Okay. The second one. This is a second half of life practice. So I don't want to talk too much about that. I would love to at some other point, but this idea comes from Jungian psychology that we spend our first half of life, most of us, accumulating, creating who we are. And we spend our second half of life releasing all of that. Now, in terms of linearity, that's bonkers, right? When I was diagnosed at 31, I was thrust into my second half of life. So it doesn't always follow that kind of thing. And I don't think that we only have one first half of life and one second half of life. I think we go in circular times. We have times when we are really putting together our psyches, really working on accumulating and figuring out who we are, and then we have times of release. I have complex PTSD from childhood abuse. There's no way during the times where I really need acute healing, there's no way I should be working on surrender. I need to be working on accumulation. I need to be putting myself back together, my psyche back together. Okay, so this is only a practice when we are not doing that kind of thing. Does that make sense? Oh, and the last one. This path of surrender does not ask us to give up our work for justice in our lives or in the world. Jesus himself never surrendered that work, right? Because my mind doesn't want to surrender, so it will come up with every little thing. I can't let go because then who's going to fight Trump? Who's going to do that? Who's going to do that? We're not talking about that. What we're talking about is usually in a Buddhist way, my attachment to that, right? So my idea to how things should be. Jesus didn't give up his fights for justice, but he certainly gave up that he was going to get to continue it in form, right? He said, y'all have to do it after me. That's a really big piece of surrender, but he never gave up his belief in his work that empire needed to go. All right, so those are the three that I want to just mention. Next slide. You can say whatever you can say.
Yeah, so that last one, like, before I met Amy, there was a long period of time where I was on a path where this idea of surrender like led kind of astray. So led off to in a direction of what we call, what we call in the culture spiritual bypass. Of like really moving to the place of like letting it all go means, letting go of attachment, letting go of the world, being outside of the culture of the dream of everybody is what we're doing here together, is like, then I don't have to be responsible for anything. The only thing I'm responsible for is my own connection to God, and everything else is irrelevant. And that takes us away from, my experience of that was it took me away from being able to really embrace what it means to be human, what it means to be here. Jesus didn't, we were talking, Amy has already talked about that. He was God as a human, like as a full embrace of humanity, of the experience of being here, of everything that means, including our relationships with one another individually, our relationships to society and culture and all those things. Like, it's all part of it. And it's, you can take the idea of surrender to where you disconnect, right? And that's a spiritual bypass.
Thank you. Super important. Super important.
Can you say a little bit more about spiritual bypassing and what that means?
Spiritual bypass is having some strong experience with this myself. It's to take an idea or a concept of what God is, or even a mystical experience of God. So a direct connection with God, and placing that as that's what's important above everything else, and to try and just stay there in that. So we have these moments of enlightenment, of God's love inside of us, and to latch onto that as a place where like that's the only thing that's important, is trying to get back to that experience. And when we do that, we are bypassing all of our personal stuff Okay, all of the places where we're stuck, where we are, and Christians, we're like sinning, like missing the mark. All the places we're missing the mark in our lives with other people, not loving, not being connected with people, you know, focusing on ourselves instead of other people. Like we try and skip over all of that and just say, what's important is for me to maintain my connection with God as a state that is above, that is placed above my humanity, right? To try and attain a state that's past my humanity, to bypass my humanity, instead of going through this incredible gift of a life that we're given, living through that life.
A concrete example that Christians have been accused of is, we're not gonna dismantle racism because it's all in God's hands.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
But another thing is that I think the spiritual bypass, one of the ways that you can recognize it is that you're no longer humble, you're no longer open, you know? And so when you find that you're like, I know best, or I'm closed, or I have the golden moment experience, and you know, I'm off the path a little bit here, and finding ways to open yourself up.
My version was unpassed process.
Past process.
I'm
Wow.
gonna hit when he was past process.
I love that.
So I just pushed a few buttons. I'm seeing it a lot nowadays too with certain groups of spiritual people who will say like, it's all gonna work out. Yeah, these people are hurting but it's all for the good. We're all one, it's all connected.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
I just found another permanent Stations of the Cross
Where's that?
in Golden.
I don't know.
Mother Cabrini Shrine.
Oh, yes.
Oh,
yes,
yeah.
indeed.
Yes.
Yes.
Oh,
Yes.
Stairs going up the mountain.
That's, yes, it is fantastic.
Yeah.
There are a lot of places if you start looking. Yeah.
And one,
Yeah.
one thing that keeps coming to me is I'm gonna say it.
Yeah.
So Christ, and I'm going back to the week we talked about his temptations.
Yes.
I can't remember where it was explained to me, but it was, well, you can save yourself if you're the Christ.
Yeah.
And the way I looked at that for a long time is Christ kind of, he was God, but as fully human, he knew it, but he chose to put that behind him. Does that make sense? And go through all of this and all that he went through without giving up his work, as you said.
Yeah.
That for some reason, that image just keeps coming to me.
Yes, I like that. Thank you.
I know what time it is.
So we're gonna go into practice. I just chose 3 stations. We could have chosen any. But first, what I want you to do, if you're comfortable closing your eyes, allow yourself to think about, to be surprised by something in your life that you are being asked to surrender. For some of us, it might be something big. It might just be a grudge you're holding. It could be a diagnosis you have, a way of life that you need to give up. One little thing that you're being asked to surrender. And hold that in your heart as we go through these practices. Got it. You can open your eyes. All right, so we will be looking at stations 8, 11, and 13. And as I said, we'll do a different contemplative practice with each. So the first one for station 8, I'm going to do Lectio. I did some great Lectio Puridici.
Thank you. We're gonna do a very similar kind of process. We will read this passage 4 times. I'll do the first, and if I can have some other people do it. And I'll walk you through what to do with each reading. Okay. So some of you it's best for you to go into a more contemplative place if you close your eyes and listen. Some of you that won't work for, so whatever works for you. And there followed him a great multitude of people and of women who bewailed and lamented him. But Jesus, turning to them, said, "Daughters of Jerusalem, do not weep for me, but weep for yourselves and for your children. For behold, the days are coming when they will say, 'Blessed are the barren, and the wombs that never bore, and the breasts that never gave suck.' Then they will begin to say to the mountains, 'Fall on us,' and to the hills, 'Cover us.' For if they do this when the wood is green, what will happen when it's dry?" Sit for a moment in silence with that. I'm going to ask Raven to read it. And now, as you listen, just allow a word or a phrase to come to you. Try not to analyze it. Just allow something, but something that sparkles is how we often say it. Yeah.
And there followed him a great multitude of people, and of women who bewailed and lamented him. But Jesus, turning to them, said, "Daughters of Jerusalem, do not weep for me, but weep for yourselves and for your children. For behold, the days are coming when they will say, 'Blessed are the barren, and the wombs that never bore, and the breasts that never gave suck.' Then they will begin to say to the mountains, 'Fall on us,' and to the hills, 'Cover us.' For if they do this when the wood is green, what will happen when it is dry?"
Popcorn style, you can share your word.
Dry.
Barren,
Multitude.
Weep.
Daughters.
Bewailed. Yourselves. Another time, and as we do, call to mind what you were thinking about in terms of surrender, what you're being asked to let go of. And hear this passage in light of that. What does this passage have to say to you today about that thing that you're being invited to surrender? Would someone read for me?
And there followed him a great multitude of the people, and of women who bewailed and lamented him. But Jesus, turning to them, said, "Daughters of Jerusalem, do not weep for me, but weep for yourselves and for your children. For behold, the days are coming when they will say, 'Blessed are the barren, and the wombs that never bore, and the breasts that never gave suck.' Then they will begin to say to the mountains, 'Fall on us,' and to the hills, 'Cover us.' For if they do this when the wood is green, what will happen when it is dry?"
Excellent. Anyone feels like sharing how this is speaking to you about your act of surrender?
I've let go of so much. So most of what I have now is really petty. But I think back to that multitude. And how heavy the air must have been. There's so many people. So much, I mean, emotion, it just must have been heavy with so much emotion.
I think this is more of an interpretation than anything else, but to me, there's sort of a surrendering of the title of maybe motherhood. And sort of just like that in itself. I guess almost there's something to be gained in the surrender, and maybe what you're getting is like connection with God is what I'm getting, but.
Thank you.
To me, it doesn't sound very, it sounds to me like it's just gonna get much, much worse, so I don't want, it's not really helping at this point.
It's like,
It's not helping me because this sounds like, if you think this is bad, wait a little while. But maybe I'm just reading it.
How might that relate to surrender for you?
Well, that's what I'm saying, it just sounds like, well, maybe you have to practice now because it's gonna get so much worse.
That's kind of how I'm interpreting it too, because you said to think of something and like, when I lost my job, the very first thought I had was like, we're gonna go bankrupt, like I know it. And like, we're in a truly horrifying amount of debt. And I thought things were bad when I had a job, I was making a lot of money. And now it's like, I thought things were bad, they're horrible now, and it's only gonna get worse. And I'm trying to surrender to like, it's just money, if I go bankrupt, and then, you know, my credit, but like, I'm not a terrible person. And that, over the last, it's been almost a year since I lost my job, I've been having to like really accept it. That like, if this happens, like, I'm not a bad person. And some days it's hard.
Yeah, and that, I think that's such a great example of how many things you're surrendering. So you're surrendering the job and feeling financially secure. But I hear a deeper level of surrender too, is that this idea that there's something about your value as a person connected with making money, which we got from our culture, right? Yeah, so there's all these levels of surrender.
I feel that way about Bob and I have been talking, surrendering being middle-aged to being old. I said older, you know. And when you asked what we would surrender, I'm thinking, it sounds petty, but it goes deeper. Athleticism, strength, and size 6 pants. And but for me, that was a lot of my, you know, it was what I enjoyed. Identity and everything, and I'm just the last few days seeing that I'm on that back to the earth here, the way down. And so when I read this, I think, what waning? Yes, but the days are coming. As a mother, you know, you have to be in a scary place to wish you never had your kids, or have really scary kids. It's either way. But then, what I feel God is doing is, it's like, on the way down, let go of all those things because they really weren't that important. I'm gonna, as you go down, as you need the real things, I will provide the real things. So.
Yeah.
I hear it kind of as an encouragement to like think bigger, you know, like you're having you're weeping for me, but you're weeping for, like, you're making this about you. And like, if you could broaden the window and think, put your suffering like in the context of like the mountains falling on everyone and cover the hills covering all of us, like that's kind of how I hear it, so put this in the right context. You know, it's not your weeping, it's what about everything is.
I listen to people talk and I don't even think about it now, but when I first started using this, the surrender, to use this, you know, well, what's worse? Using a cane or falling down and getting hurt? Because I was only 40. I've been using this for 20 years. You know, it's like, I'm only 40, I shouldn't be using a cane. But I started using it when I fell down 3 times in 1 week because I couldn't keep my balance. It wasn't because I was weak, but it was because I couldn't keep my balance. Because there's something seriously wrong inside my head. But that was surrender.
That brings me back to what Dicey says about the, you know, bad person idea. Being a bad person if you have a disability, or being a bad person if you're out of money and
You're on food stamps.
you're on food stamps, or it reminds, I mean, that was what I meant by the empire as part of Jesus's journey. And, you know, the Romans were saying one thing and he was living a very different experience. Phil, did you have anything or not? I want to give you a chance. Nothing.
No, go ahead, I'm sorry. It's me talking, you go ahead.
I just think the word lamented as used in this passage is so multifaceted. So to lament for what Christ has done for us and for where we are. And also, I think we all share a lot of lamenting health issues and where we are, and just surrender, like I've surrendered a lot, and I think a lot of other people here have, as far as their health goes. And then just moving forward through the hard times.
Thank you, I like that too. Real briefly today, what this passage is speaking to me is, I can get really afraid, of course, for what's going on and for our kids and our country, and they're both in healthcare, and who knows what that job is gonna look like in a few years. This reminds me to get bigger, like you were saying, and limit, yes, all of the structural things that are changing, but like our humanity feels like our humanity is changing, and that feels good.
Don't group us all together, they're really ugly people.
We all have a really ugly part of us. I mean, I said.
I don't know, I don't think of this, I guess maybe because I work with people so traumatized and I see the inner person, and it's not the ugly behaviors. But then I see this passage and it makes me smile, because my father used to say, cheer up, things could get worse. So I cheered up and they got worse.
There you go.
So I don't think of it as surrender.
I'll read it one more time and then we will go on with public when we do one of this. And there followed him a great multitude of the people and of women who bewailed and lamented him. But Jesus, turning to them, said, daughters of Jerusalem, do not weep for me, but weep for yourselves and for your children. For behold, the days are coming when they will say, blessed are the barren, and the wombs that never bore, and the breasts that never gave suck. Then they will begin to say to the mountains, fall on us, and to the hills, cover us. For if they do this when the wood is green, what will happen when it is dry? Super briefly, we only have a few minutes. We will go to the next slide. And well, I don't know if she can see it on the screen or she's looking. We're gonna do a Visio Divina with this image.
You got that.
So let me just give you a couple details about that, this image. It's called Cruz Cosmic, which means cosmic Christ. However, when I was writing my dissertation in 2016, it was not called that. It was called Cosmic Core in English, Core, C-O-R-E. Very interesting, yeah. It is made with a drill on canvas. So think about that, right? What it looks like and the motion of that, a drill. And the dimensions are about 7.5 feet by 5, a little over 5 feet of the whole image. So just to give you kind of placement. So when we do Visio, it's similar to Lexio.
Is this the right slide or do I need to?
You need to go one more. Just one more. Let me go.
Oh, there it is, okay.
So just taking a moment to look at this image. Allow it to speak to you and same thing, popcorn, just a word that comes to your heart or your mind as you encounter this image. Fluid. Fluid. Center. Energy, movement, yeah. Form, without form, orbit,
Um,
You're allowing yourself to, again, meet this image and see what does it have for me today in terms of what I'm working with surrender. What's the message for me today?
washed.
And is that appropriate for you today, Nancy, for some reason, or?
It just seems kind of like I don't know, it makes me think of a car wash almost.
Or a whirlpool.
Yeah,
Yeah,
It's got a very water-like. But it, clean all through and through.
mm-hmm. But not scary, you're not.
No.
I noticed the only vertical circle. The halo.
Mhm.
How does that speak to you right now?
I'm gonna have to sit with that.
Yeah.
But I saw that first. There's an artist's eye or.
Looks to me like no choice but to surrender.
It's like surrender at all levels, so there's all of the different levels, perceptual places you can perceive it from. Not perceive, like shift where you're looking. Which part of it is. Essentially.
Is that appropriate for you?
Yeah.
No, it makes me think of a line from a poem that my sister wrote, "Take and clean this vessel as clean as it can be."
Your sister wrote that?
Since losing my job, I've decided I better come out of this with a talent, so I've been learning to play the ukulele and write songs. I have like a baritone ukulele, so it kind of sounds like a guitar. And so I wrote a song called "The Weight of Water," a song about baptism. And y'all ever heard me talk about like when I was in Hawaii and I went out in the ocean and I like got dunked by a wave, and the waves in the Pacific Ocean are no joke. So I was just like, okay, well, I'm gonna die. I guess this is how I crash and break my neck. And
But then like the next thing I knew, I was like on the beach. I was like, how did I get here? And at the time I was an atheist and I was like, And anyway, in the song, I have a line that says, when I surrender to the fear, I feel the holy drawing near. And this picture kind of makes me think of that. Like the holy is all around in the world, because this makes me think of like galaxies and stuff, but like God is through it.
Make this much difference, yeah. Yeah.
I used to pray, and I still do, for people that genuinely feel Christ enclosing them. And when I look at this again, it's almost like a protection. There's, so for me, there's the movement, and you don't usually think really of Christ on the cross is moving, but this has so many levels and layers to it.
The cocoon.
Thank you, thank you.
I see that now. Thank you, I wouldn't have thought about that till you said that.
But you came up with the word.
So I have a lot to be hopeful for. And, but at Morning Star, there's so many people who don't know Christ and don't know God. And I'd like to ask everybody here not to forget them, because as much as I'm struggling and other people are struggling with their health, one day we will be with Christ. And we will, when Christ says he will be here till the end of time, that means the end of time. There is no end of time. But there are people who don't know Christ or have chosen not that they don't exist. And I would pray that all of us would run into somebody and have the chance to offer that. That would be my hope today.
Thank you.
Are you at the new Morning Star on North College?
It's Tenney, so it's
Yes.
on North College, yes.
Yeah.
This image.
There's one man that I tried to for a long time to witness to, and he doesn't believe in God, and he just thinks he's gonna be a pile of dirt. And I tried to tell him that that's not true, and then he was a professor at a school, and professors know everything. And I say that I don't say that in criticism, I just say that in sometimes people don't let the truth come through to them.
I think we can all get kind of tangled up in what we know and what we don't know, and so, yeah, it's a good message to remember that we all need to be humble about all that, yeah.
Yeah, to surrender what we don't know.
Surrender what we don't know, that's a good way to put it.
Exactly. We don't have time for the last practice, but if you want a little booklet, the same stuff is in there. We were going to do imaginative prayer on this passage. An imaginative prayer, for those of you who have time, maybe to get to go home. It is an Ignatian form of contemplation where we read a passage and really picture ourselves there. Use your senses. You can use your practices from last week. Use your senses to really help the scene come alive. You might be a character in that passage. You might be a bystander, and just allow your imagination to take you deeper into the scene. So I'm offering that for this passage from Luke, the second passage from Luke.
Is that Midrash? Is that the same as Midrash?
No, Midrash is much more heavy. Midrash is when we each take scripture and we share our point of view on it. It could be a point of view too, but we it's one of my favorites. It's Jewish way of things, but it is, the idea is that every scripture has, well, you see it like a jewel,
but each of us is one facet, or we're looking at as one facet, and we need all of those pieces. Yeah.
Imaginative prayer, when I first learned it, I thought, oh, that isn't the way we've always been reading scripture, because I always just picture myself there. But it was kind of radical when St. Ignatius mentioned it to folks, so. Here you are.
Thank you.
Thanks, Carol.
Thanks, Carol.
Yeah, for me, I learned if I were to surrender